we're going to start looking at cutting fabric, and this is an area where people get very frightened about, particularly if you've got a nice expensive fabric and you're a bit worried about getting the cutting wrong. There is quite a lot to navigate when it comes to cutting fabric. So we're going to look at a couple of bits of terminology and how you go about cutting fabric so you've got the right number of pieces for your pattern. And we're going to look at actually some of the things you need to consider when you've got different types of fabric. And then on top of that, we'll look at some of the techniques that we use and the tools that might be available to you to help cut your fabric up. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the terminology involved. And for this, I'm going to just bring in my Doris here. So this is Doris, my mannequin, as you may remember. So previously we spoke about how patterns are developed from block, and these blocks essentially relate to quadrants of your body. So if you're working on a front bodice piece, this part will be, the pattern will be designed from this quarter here, and you'll have one for the front, one for the back, skirt back, skirt front, sleeve, etc, etc. So patterns, generally speaking, are only half or quarter of your body, and I'll just show you an example here. There we go. Which means it's really important that you cut either two of them, or you cut it on a folded piece of fabric so that when it opens up, you have the other side as well. So in this instance, this pattern piece requires you to cut on the fold, and that is a very common phrase you will come across time and time again when you are cutting out patterns. So when it says to cut on fold, what it means is that you typically would be folding your fabric from selvage to selvage across the weft line to create a center fold bit in the middle. Okay, and that's the line you would place any pattern pieces that require you to cut on the fold against. Okay, some pattern pieces just require you to cut two of them, so you will be able to place those elsewhere on the pattern. So that's cutting on the fold. Sometimes, however, you do get patterns that have a very voluminous skirt or sleeve, and that will require you to use a little bit more fabric. Now, if we go back to considering the width of the fabric, if you've got a 45-inch wide piece of fabric, when you've folded that in half, that reduces that right down to 22.5 inches, and sometimes that width on the fold just isn't enough. Okay, so you may come across a term called cutting crossways, and that's when you take your fabric width, and instead of folding it over the weft line, you fold it across the warp line. Okay, and if you, I've got about 1 meter of fabric here, but you can have however long you need. So you might have 6 or 7 meters of fabric, which means that this allows you to again create a nice fold, but with a very wide width. So that's cutting crossways. What you have to consider, however, is the type of fabric that you have, because if your fabric is directional, for example, let's take this one here, these monsters, you can cut on the fold across the weft line very easily, and you'll have your monsters in one direction on one side and your monsters in the same direction on the other side. But if you were to fold it crossways, you'd have your monsters the right way round on one side, but not on the other side. So you have to be very mindful of that, and it may require you to cut across the lines before you then commit to cutting your patterns. So just to kind of elaborate a little bit on the previous point about directional and non-directional fabrics, I would say that if you haven't ever sewn before, one of the easiest fabrics to work with is a fabric that's got a pattern on it, but it's non-directional, which means that you could cut in any direction along those grain lines, okay, and it wouldn't make a huge amount of difference. What they tend to have is a very deliberate right side of the fabric and wrong side of the fabric, which means it's very easy to make sure that you have mirror images, pairs of different parts of your pattern or your body, and you're very unlikely to sew it the wrong way round. As I said, if you've got directional fabric, and this isn't just necessarily pattern direction, this might be if you've got a nap to the fabric. So a nap is a word that is used to describe if the fabric has got fibre or pile that is on the outside of the fabric, like a velvet or a corduroy, that needs to be controlled because it will go in one direction. And yeah, you need to consider, because if you're using this sort of fabric, you can only cut it in one direction, so you may need a little bit of extra fabric if you are going to be using directional or napped fabric. And I think probably the hardest one to work with, which is quite interesting because it on the outset it looks like it might be the easiest, is sort of plainer fabrics, because what tends to happen is there's no discernible right side and wrong side to it, and then what happens is people quite often accidentally sew some of the detail, like darts, into the fabric, and you end up with two left sides or two right sides, and you have to do a little bit of unpicking. So if you are using plain fabric, you can use masking tape, obviously, to mark out what the right side of the fabric is and what the wrong side of the fabric is, to assist in your sewing. But I would say if you've never sewn before, it's a really good idea to try and get a nice multi-directional piece of fabric.